Within these prehistoric lands lives a dangerous world, where animals will be forced to adapt, alliances will form, and life must face the harsh realities of Mother Nature itself. I transformed this barren wasteland into a thriving, robust, but deadly ecosystem. Can life find a way, or is it all doomed to die? Well, to understand this journey, we must go back to day 1. Our journey begins in Canada, which will be the base for this ecosystem. First, I had to place down a hatchery so that we could incubate some eggs, and after doing that, I set to work on what would be our first biome, which would be the forest biome. The forest biome was preferred by a lot of our species, particularly the herbivores, and it made sense for our starter biome, and I made sure to add lots of vegetation for them to graze on and water areas for them to drink at. With the beginning of the habitat made, it was now time to get in the lab and start introducing the first dinos to our ecosystem. The first two out were a pair of Diplodocus, and I'd like to introduce you to Dippy and Sally. Dippy and Sally were shortly followed out the paddock by a small herd of Styracosaurus, who would become the second dinosaur into our ecosystem. Once I'd let these creatures get settled in, I considered what to introduce next, and settled on the Oviraptor. Despite having a bit of a bad rap for always wanting to steal eggs, the Oviraptor is actually an omnivore, and was perfectly happy to chew on the local greenery, but I did of course add some meat in for it as well, just in case it wanted to mix up its diet. While I let our first set of arrivals all settle in and explore the brand new ecosystem, I began work on a secondary biome, which I would call the Tundra. As you would expect with a tundra biome, the creatures that would live there would have to be able to live in the harsher conditions, but they would still need their trees and later down the line vegetation also, so along with some water areas I made a start on the biome. And our first addition to this biome would be the Pyroraptor, from the late Cretaceous period roughly 70 million years ago. Belonging to the same family as its more famous cousin the Velociraptor, if you've seen Jurassic World Dominion, I'm sure you recognise this dinosaur. This pack hunter was not to be messed with, and with strength in numbers, it would be a formidable opponent for any neighbouring creature. Back in our friendly herbivore-only forest ecosystem, I chose our next creature to add, which was the Mycoceratus, one of the earliest known members of the Ceratopsian family, the same family that the famous dinosaurs such as the Triceratops are part of. This dinosaur was apparently able to not only stand on its 4 legs, but also rear up on 2 legs, in order to help it reach some more vegetation. Checking back in on our Pyroraptors, they were settling in nicely, and I caught some of them having a drink from the nearest water source. They would have to enjoy their role as alpha of the tundra biome while it lasted, as there would soon be even bigger creatures roaming these lands. I started to look at what creatures the Pyroraptors might be able to mix with, but while I was doing this, I was immediately alerted that one of my Oviraptors had suddenly become ill due to a lack of ground leaf, so I immediately saw to that before the rest of its kind followed suit. But back in the tundra, we welcomed our second creature, the Spinosaurus Rex, to the ecosystem. It claimed that the Pyroraptor was a fan of scavengers, but I wasn't sure if this was because they liked their company or because they offered an easy snack on demand. Time would tell on that one, but that is why I only released 2 to start with, so that I didn't have too much blood on my hands if it all went south. And indeed it did go south, and the first experiment of this ecosystem was a classified failure, as I watched the last dinosaur and waited for the inevitable to happen. At first the Pyroraptor went in for the kill and stopped itself, and I thought that maybe it had a change of heart, but it hadn't. So away from the murdering Pyroraptors, I decided to play it safe with my next introduction, and went for a small herd of Parasaurolophuses, which you can't go wrong with. Surely nothing could happen to any of these, could it? Now, this video is not sponsored, but I did just want to take a minute to tell you guys about my recently launched business, Dinosaur World. At Dinosaur World, you can purchase yourself a variety of dinosaur toys, cosmetics, DVDs, you name it. Dinosaur World is a brand new business created by myself and fellow YouTuber Lowy, and it isn't some sort of dropshipping thing. I am currently recording this video script in my office, surrounded by dinosaur toys, so please buy something and spare me some space. We are a UK-based business, but do ship internationally, but sadly we can't ship to Europe right now thanks to this blonde bimbo and Brexit, but hopefully in the future we will be able to again. The link to Dinosaur World can be found on screen now and also in the description. Thank you guys for hearing me out, I really appreciate it. Now back to the video. It was now time to add a classic and favourite dino to the ecosystem, which was the Dilophosaur. After creating a separate habitat for these creatures due to their inability to get on with basically anything, I decided to mess with the genes a little bit. These were not going to be any ordinary Dilophosaurs. They were more resilient, more aggressive, and more lethal than any Dilophosaurs seen before. As I opened the gate and watched them settle into their new habitat, I knew that if these stuck together as a group and hunted in the pack, they would be one of the most deadly predators this ecosystem would have. While the Dilophosaurs adjusted to their new life, I expanded the snow territory a little bit, as I wasn't going to be releasing any more creatures right into Pyroraptor territory. With a secondary hatchery placed down, it was now time to start incubating some eggs. But before I had time to go any further, my attention was diverted back to the forest, where one of our Microceratus had developed algae poisoning, which was apparently due to a lack of water, so I quickly added a little bit more water into the forest environment. With that problem dealt with, I could now welcome these tiny little tyrannosaurs into the ecosystem. The Moros intrepidus were very, very cute, and we're not going to bother anyone or anything in this ecosystem, but I would have to make sure that I kept these safe from predators, which was going to be a tough task. For now though, they could safely eat from the feeder with no competition. And to keep them company, I decided to release more Spinosaurus after the last ones had mysteriously disappeared through no fault of my own. I added some rocks, water and more feeders into the general area, so both of these recent additions helped to feel more right at home. Right next to our Tundra ecosystem though, it was time to work on the next biome, which would be the desert. I began to turn the grassy lands into pure sand, but before getting far too involved with this section of the ecosystem, I decided to pop back to the forest area and look at introducing some more carnivores. I began to craft a biome for them, adding in lots of foresty trees and water areas for them to take a drink. However, before releasing any, a snowstorm hit, and life in our ecosystem went into survival mode. The Pyroraptors looked right at home in these conditions and appeared utterly unbothered. The Oviraptors and Sally the Diplo were a little bit less impressed with the weather conditions, however. They were potentially going to be even less impressed by what happened later that night, as the Allosaurus was released into the ecosystem. So I'd like you all to meet Henry, Margaret and Ralph, who look set to run this corner of the ecosystem for quite some time. However, shortly after naming the Allosaurs, I received news that one of our parasaurs had contacted hypothermia due to the severe weather conditions that were going on right now. Without medical attention, there was a chance that our parasaur would never be able to recover from this, but time would tell on this. Back with the Allosaurs, they appeared to be getting settled in well, but I decided that they needed a friend, and luckily they get on well with the villains of the last ecosystem video that I did, the Ceratosaurus. These medium-sized theropods would be fine to share their territory with the Allosaurs, and together formed a formidable alliance. However, with a pack of 6 genetically modified Dilophosaurs only living next door, time would tell on who could survive. Checking in on our parasaur, who I had now named Trevor by the way, unfortunately the hypothermia symptoms were getting worse, and Trevor was slowly dying. Low on strength, only a miracle could save Trevor from death. But even with the harsh reality of Mother Nature coming to fruition, we had to press on with the building of our ecosystem, and the next creature that walked through the gates was a pair of Brachiosauruses. This late Jurassic creature was last seen on the Earth roughly 150 to 154 million years ago, and was one of the biggest sauropods to ever walk the Earth. Checking in on Trevor, he was not doing well. On top of his hypothermia, he had developed a common cold, so I tried to add as much vegetation and water around him in case he did wake up and fancy a snack. Things, however, were continuing to look bleaker and bleaker. But alas, the journey must continue, and on day 10, it was time to continue work on the desert section of the ecosystem. After placing down some more trees and water sources, I identified the first creatures that were going to be added in, the Carnotaurus. Found in the late Cretaceous period, the Carnotaurus possessed a pair of arms even shorter than T-Rex's, but with the ability to reach speeds of 30 to 35 miles an hour, not many dinosaurs would be able to escape its jaws. As they settled in and worked out their pack order, I named the alpha of the pack Alpha Bob, and then watched them happily tussle in with each other, safe in the knowledge that they own this desert ecosystem all to themselves, for now. Unfortunately for Trevor, he had not been able to shake off the effects of his hypothermia, and Mother Nature took its first casualty of our ecosystem. Please show some respect for Trevor in the comments below. At least the carnivores of the ecosystem were on their best behaviour, with the Allosaurs, Ceratosaurs, Dilophosaurs and Pyroraptors all keeping to their territory. The Carnotaur family were also having the absolute best time, as I caught this one here rolling in the sand and doing something I'd expect from my huskies. It was time to release some more herbivores into the desert also, but of course I couldn't release them right into where the Carnotaurs ruled, so I placed another hatchery further down the biome and began to incubate some Ankylosaur eggs. They were soon ready to be introduced into the ecosystem, and I'd like to welcome Sharon, John and Janet into the ecosystem. As I seem to be in the process of introducing iconic herbivore dinosaurs, the next creature I added was the Triceratops, T-Rex's fierce rival, and perhaps we'll be seeing more of this fight later on. As you can see, all the herbivores were positioned nicely away from the Carnotaurs, and I was confident that they should be able to live in harmony together. This was until I noticed a rather disturbing thing. Despite being a fan of the sandy biome, the Carnotaurus appeared to have all left the newly created desert biome and were setting up camp in the far western section of our Tundra biome. All except for Alpha Bob, who was slowly making his way down towards our herbivores. Apparently though, the herbivores had far bigger priorities, as Janet and John the Ankylosaurs were fighting for that alpha role. Of course, John soon retreated, and Janet could now be referred to as Alpha Jan, the alpha of the Ankylosaurids. I then had to build a brand new separated section of our forest ecosystem to fit our next creature in. But no, it was not a carnivore, but rather a Therizinosaurus, one of the most bizarre and unique dinosaurs. With its large claws, this herbivore was not to be messed with, and it was not a fan of many other dinosaurs. As I released Kevin from the hatchery, I admired his unique looks before seeing what dinosaurs that I could put him with. The problem was that Kevin didn't like very much, only the Lystrasaurus, who then apparently did not like Kevin's, which made the whole situation rather bizarre. Before I could investigate this situation further, however, I was dragged away to some shocking news. A wandering Ceratosaur had accidentally found himself in Dilophosaur territory, and had paid the price for it. While the Dilophosaurs slept next to their kill, I decided it was time to give these guys a name, as if they could maintain their strength in numbers approach, they were going to be a force to be reckoned with. Back in Kevin territory, I released the Lystrasaurs and watched them waddle into their brand new habitat. I was slightly cautious that Kevin might like these things just because he wanted to chase and terrorise them, but he did seem pretty at home with them, even though the Lystros were apparently not a fan of him. In the desert, I released our next scavenger, the Compsognathus. This scavenger was a fan of every creature apparently, and would fit in very well with our Ankylos and Trikes. In the northern region of our ecosystem, I saw that one very brave Dilophosaur had ventured into Ceratosaur and Allosaur territory. As I watched this creature take a drink at the pool while the much larger carnivores prowled in the distance, I decided to name him Lancelot after their bravery. While Lancelot was enjoying a snack at the nearby feeder, when a Ceratosaur showed up on the scene, they soon fled. While the Dilophosaurs had taken down a Ceratosaur as a pack only a couple of days ago, picking a 1 versus 1 fight was probably not a good idea for Lancelot. After the Ceratosaur had finished its fill, however, Lancelot returned to the feeder once more, only to have to scurry off once more when an Allosaur arrived at the scene. He would have to wait for the Allosaur to finish first. On day 20, I received some shocking news that the Carnotaur pack had found the Triceratops and a fight was breaking out. However, a fight with the Triceratops was not to be taken lightly, and this Carnotaurus was lucky to get away with its life on this occasion, fleeing after being brought to the brink of death. I named the Carno Lucky, but Lucky would have to fully recover before it could take on any of the other tough herbivores that this ecosystem possessed. Janet and John the Ankylosaurs were still fighting, by the way. I'm sure you can see why these were named after my parents. And by this point, Janet once more was coming out on top. Lucky the Carnotaur was still dazed from its last fight, and appeared to be looking for a way out of the ecosystem. Checking in on Kevin, I caught him having a relaxing drink in his local spa, before receiving word that Lancelot was directly facing down a Ceratosaur. Amazingly, Lancelot won this face-off and the Ceratosaur retreated. These dinos were truly not to be messed with. For Lucky, it was not going to be second time, well, lucky, as Sharon killed her with a single swing of her club. It was a sad ending for our lost Carnotaurus. The noise of the fight though had driven the rest of the Carnotaurs over, but this Carnotaur was not going to be stupid enough to challenge 2 Ankylosaurs at once. Anyway, it didn't have a chance, as later that day another snowstorm hit, and our creatures buckled down to deal with the extreme conditions once more. Unfortunately, Slayer the Dilophosaur had contacted hypothermia, and was completely sapped of energy. Lancelot the Dilophosaur was still trapped in Allosaur territory, and Kevin the Therizino was just chilling out. The next day though, things had calmed down, and life returned to normality. A Triceratops faced down a Carnotaurus, and when it moved into attack, it struck a killer blow. So far, the Carnotaurs had had a pretty rough time of it, and perhaps should have stayed in their own environment that I had carefully handcrafted for them. It was now time for a new addition to our Tundra ecosystem, but just as I was about to release our creature, I was called again away to witness the Dilophosaur pack strike again. This time, the victim would be even bigger than the Ceratosaur. It would be an Allosaurus, who despite its continued attempts to get up and escape the pack, could not manage to get away from all of them. It was a sad end for our Allosaur, and the Dilophosaurs had struck again. Lancelot was still deep in Ceratosaur territory, although both were still avoiding direct confrontation. Slayer the Dilophosaur had now passed away sadly due to the effects of hypothermia, and I found his body being eaten by another Dilophosaur. Bloody cannibals. In the Tundra, we could finally introduce our latest arrival, which was the Dinochirus. These omnivores, who like fish as well as plants, would be able to put up a strong fight against most creatures in this ecosystem and were a very welcome addition to our tundra biome. But next up, back in the desert, it was time to introduce the Tyrant Lizard King. Wait, hang on a minute, that's not a T-Rex. No, it wasn't, not just yet. Instead, down in the herbivore area, guarded by Trikes and Ankylos, we welcome the Iguanodon to the ecosystem. And with the latest arrivals getting settled in, I expanded the ecosystem slightly, adding in some more water sections as well as some more foliage. But in the forest section of the ecosystem, a lost Pyroraptor had ended up in Dilophosaur territory, and things were not looking good. It may have just about escaped from this fight alive, but with organ trauma as a result, its prospects were not looking good. All this fighting though had distracted me from my latest arrivals, and my Dinocheiruses were missing some water, so I made an effort to add some more patches of water in for them. The injured Pyroraptor was now fleeing for its life, but the Dilophosaur pack, who I had now fully named, were hot in pursuit, sensing an easy kill. Eventually the Pyroraptor could run no more, and with one pounce from the Dilophosaur, this raptor's journey was over. At least our Iguanodons were settling in well, and I had some presents for them. First some water, and then some friends. Welcome Terrence and Matilda, our pair of genetically buffed Tyrannosaurus Rexes, to this ecosystem. I made sure to add some water and feeders towards the snow ecosystem, as we didn't want Terrence and Matilda straying too far away from their initial feeding ground and into herbivore territory. That would be absolutely terrible, wouldn't it? The ecosystem was coming together nicely, as creatures kept to their respective territories and had their established pack orders all organised. This was until Matilda the Tyrannosaur decided to behave like my husky when I let him off the leash, and the minute she was out at the hatchery, she absolutely ran for the hills, ending up on the outskirts of the desert herbivore ecosystem. While I prepared for the incoming disaster that was clearly about to happen, I started work on our next biome, which would be the rocky biome. I decided to make this biome a little bit more sloped in places to add some variety to this ecosystem, and the dangerous Dilophosaurs were continuing to fight over who was alpha of the pack, which ended up with Rampy the Dilophosaur taking that role for now at least. Back in my rock biome, after adding some rocky terrain, I began to add some actual rocks and expand the biome some more. Next, it was time to add some water, which was going to be very important, as the creatures that were going to be put here were going to be in need of a lot of water. I finished it up by adding some trees around the place to give the dinosaurs some cover, and it was now time to look at introducing our first creature, and I began to incubate a batch of Scorpios eggs. However, I was then pulled away to some shocking news. Alpha Jan, the alpha of the Ankylosaurs, had been slaughtered by Terrence the Tyrannosaurus. While this news sent shockwaves throughout the ecosystem, I immediately checked on Terrence, who appeared to be already eyeing up his next target. At first I thought it was going to be this Triceratops, only for the Triceratops to rather sensibly run away. Instead, it was John the Ankylosaur, who was Terrence's next victim. Sharon was now the only surviving Ankylosaur left, and the Iguanodons were not looking very safe, as Terrence and Matilda prowled in the background. Back in our new biome, I continued to prepare for our new additions, and I added some fish feeders into the rocky biome, and then found a poor Spinosaurus who had died due to suffering from pneumonia, likely caused by the snowstorm. That night, as it began to snow once more, the Scorpios entered our ecosystem, and it was followed pretty much immediately out the door by its compatible family member, the Baryonyx. These fish eaters would be a great addition to our ecosystem, and likely to stick to their territory due to the amount of fish around the area. The next morning, Terrence was back to causing trouble, with this Iguanodon being on his breakfast menu. As could be predicted, things did not end well for this poor Iguanodon, as Terrence got himself his third kill of the ecosystem, and was proving himself to be an absolute menace. In this fight with the Iguanodon, he had suffered a sprain, but he would likely recover from this in some time. With all the deaths and fights so far, it felt only a matter of time until we saw that historic Cretaceous rivalry with a likely face-off between Terrence and one of our Triceratops. I felt the Tundra had room for another small carnivore, so I opted to introduce the Therizinosaurus. One of the few Triassic creatures to feature in this ecosystem, the Therizinosaurus belonged in a time where dinosaurs were just beginning to form and dominate the landscape. Here though, it would have to adapt, and fast, if it wanted to survive. As our ecosystem was now getting a bit more full, I added in some more forest so that creatures could then expand their territory, and then added some light sand in for the Scorpios, who were apparently in need of some. I then caught Terrence in a fight with Sharon, the last remaining Ankylosaur. If Terence was to succeed in this fight, he would have successfully wiped out an entire species, and reinforced himself as the villain of the ecosystem. However, before he had a chance to deal a killer blow, a Triceratops joined the fight and chased Terence away. However, it appeared that the damage had already been done. As Sharon now suffered from organ trauma, it remained to be seen if she would last a night. The problem for Terence, however, was that this Tyrannosaur did not know when to quit. He went from one fight to the next, and then tried to take on two Triceratops in a battle of the Cretaceous period. He left the fight seriously wounded and suffering from surface wounds. Sadly for Sharon, she had not lasted the night, and the Ankylosaurs were once more extinct. We hadn't seen much of Matilda up until this point, but when she was challenged by a Carnotaurus, you can bet that she was not backing down. The Carnotaurus on this occasion was lucky to get away with their life. While Matilda was still queen of the jungle, Terence was suffering. His fight with the Triceratops pair had left him seriously wounded. He was now dying of thirst and hunger, and after I intervened to give him those right next to him, Terence woke up from his slumber and lifted his head. Alas, our tyrant lizard king did not have the required strength to lift himself off the ground for long enough, and as night dawned, the first villain of our ecosystem passed away. Not only had we lost Terence, but that same night I found the dead body of Alpha Bob, the former leader of the Carnotaurus pack. They were dropping like flies. It was now time to begin work on our next ecosystem, which would be completely separate from our main one, as it would be a gigantic aviary, housing flying creatures. I did have to cut away from this briefly though, to witness Matilda, the surviving Tyrannosaur, take down another Carnotaurus, who were really not doing too well at this stage. That night, a snowstorm hit. So while the creatures buckled down once more to deal with the harsh conditions, I began to construct my aviary. Inside, I made sure to try and make our flying dinosaurs feel at home as much as possible, as I added plenty of rocks for them to purchase on, as well as trees, different types of mini biomes, and of course, plenty of fish so they had some food. With that all done, it was time to release our first creature, which was the Pteranodon. This was a gigantic aviary, and while our new arrivals got themselves settled in, I continued to add a ton of forest, water and rocks to the ecosystem, as we were about to add in many more creatures to this environment, and we first led with the Dimorphodon, and then followed by the Tropionaphus. These two creatures would hopefully be able to coexist peacefully with our Pteranodons, and the early signs were positive, as I watched them all enjoy themselves on the rocks that I had placed around for them. But back in the desert, I introduced our next creature, the Dimetrodon. As my Tyrannosaurs had rejected this area and instead set up camp in Herbivore Valley, I transformed what was once a barren desert into a marshy wetland biome, so that my latest arrivals would have their needs cared for. I then caught 3 Pyroraptors next to a dead Dinosaurus, and it doesn't take too much imagination to work out what had happened here. Upon waking from their slumber, a nearby Dinosaurus took one look at its dead sibling and sensibly decided to get the hell out of Pyroraptor territory, sharpish. Back at the aviary, the latest creature to be released was the Dilophosaur, whose name I have probably mispronounced really badly. This creature is believed to have been an insectivore, meaning it would need a nice supply of juicy critters to keep it content. And next to be introduced into the ecosystem in our rocky terrain biome was the Coelophysis, which has been the bane of my life for the past 3 weeks, as all of you laughed at my pronunciation of it in the last ecosystem video.
My brain disintegrating over the course of the video due to mispronunciation.
We released another patch of Colophysis. These would be coexisting with our Suchomimus and Baryonyxes, so I checked in on our Suchos, who appear to be relishing their role as alpha of this biome, a role they would not have for much longer. As I was releasing more creatures, I decided that Kevin's biome had room for some more creatures in itself, so I released some Stegosaurus the scavengers to there. The reason the Suchomimus wasn't going to be alpha of the rocky terrain for much longer is that it was time to meet our Spinosaurus. This is Diablo, a Spinosaur with a lack of appetite for sharing its territory. At least in the aviary though, all was calm, and I was very much enjoying seeing our flying creatures rest calmly on the rocks. I'd actually forgotten to feed our poor insectivores though, so I did have to add some feeders in quickly, and they were immediately drawn to the scene. Our brand new wetlands arrivals, the Dimetrodons, were still fighting for their positions in the pack, so I let them get on with it, while I started work on a new forest biome next to the aviary. However, I was soon drawn away from this as I witnessed Diablo the Spinosaur get its first kill of our ecosystem, taking out this Baryonyx with just a single bite. He clearly had not taken too much time to show who was the boss of this ecosystem. Word had clearly reached the other Baryonyxes that there was a new king in town, and they were restless, and the nearby Triceratops were also jostling for that alpha role. A wandering Dimetrodon had strayed too far from its siblings and was easy prey for her Herrerasaurus, who had also now begun to leave their initial feeding ground in search of new prey. Shockingly, right after taking out this Dimetrodon, the same Herrerasaur didn't even stop to think, and went straight after a nearby Spinosaurus, taking out two creatures in a matter of seconds. It was due to this behaviour, and also being alpha of the pack, that I named them Absolute Menace. The Dimetrodons, surrounded by their swamp, continue to fight for dominance, clearly unaware about the dangerous Herrerasaurs that lurk nearby. After winning this fight of dominance and becoming alpha of the pack, I named this Dimetrodon Alpha Mike. The Carnotaurus also had a new leader, after the sad death of Alpha Bob earlier in this ecosystem's life, so I named him Kane. The Dinosaurs were enjoying life with their fish eaters and managing to stay away from Pyroraptor territory for now. Talking of the Pyroraptors, I named this one Pod, and watched him eagerly explore his Tundra biome, safe in the knowledge that there was strength in their pack. But it was now time to continue to carefully craft my next exhibit, as this habitat was said to house one of the most feared and dangerous creatures, the Velociraptor. On day 40, a pack of Velociraptors was unleashed on our ecosystem, led by the alpha of the pack, Blue. I knew these creatures were going to be a handful to contain, and as I watched them fight with each other and zoom around their habitat, I came up with an interesting master plan. I thought that if I distracted the Velociraptors with another similar sized creature, as they battled each other for supremacy perhaps, I could keep them away from the rest of the ecosystem. So enter the Atrociraptor. Closely related relatives, these two species of raptors would have to duke it out to work out who really owned this corner of the ecosystem. Before introducing our next theropod dinosaur, I was becoming slightly concerned that our allosaurs and ceratosaurs were getting incredibly close to the herbivore valley, the first ecosystem that I had created. So I built this great hill of Rampy, which in actual fact was probably going to do little to keep out any creature, but at least I could say I tried. Diablo the Spinosaur had now finally come face to face with a Suchomimus, and despite being from the same family, neither creature were thrilled about sharing their territory with each other. While no kill was made, the Spinosaur got away relatively unharmed, while the Suchomimus was suffering from a damaged tooth, as well as low health. When Diablo arrived on the scene, all 5 Suchomimus gathered, but didn't dare to challenge Diablo as he took fish right in front of them. I did see that our rather beautiful blue Suchomimus was the alpha of the lot of them, so I named her Alpha Susan. Back with Absolute Menace the Herrerasaur, he was living up to his name and absolutely terrorising the remaining Dimetrodons. This Dimetrodon did actually put up quite a good fight, but he was forced to retreat and flee for its life, with substantial injuries that he was unlikely to ever recover from. In the short while that I had been spectating this fight, Diablo had been very busy taking out his first Suchomimus, and while I was dealing with that situation, Absolute Menace struck again, as I caught him demolishing the body of a dead Dimetrodon. Another storm struck that night, and I got some great shots of our animals attempting to survive the frozen climate. The remaining Moros Intrepidus were keeping themselves a low profile. Blue the Velociraptor was trying to work out what the creatures she could hear in the distance were, and Absolute Menace was, well, just being himself. And the poor injured Dimetrodon that he'd injured earlier that day did not survive the night. The aviary was about to be turned on its head, as I prepared to release one of the largest flying animals to ever exist, the Quetzalcoatlus. This monster had a wingspan of between 33 to 36 feet, so it was roughly the same size as a modern-day aeroplane. This decision was sure to upset the balance of the aviary ecosystem, just like the introduction of Diablo did to our rocky terrain ecosystem, as I witnessed him take out another Baryonyx. At least Alpha Mike the Dimetrodon was still going strong, and I watched him have a meal at a nearby feeder. Later that night, it was time to unleash some biologically buffed Metrocamphosaurus into the ecosystem. In my last ecosystem story, these poor theropods had been relentlessly bullied by the Ceratosaurus, who once more were present nearby. This time I wanted to give this carnivore as much chance as possible to survive, so their attack and defense stats were boosted in the hope of some better luck this time. Unfortunately, this Herrerasaur did not have such luck, as it was taken out in one hit by Kane the Carnotaurus. The Carnotaurs appeared to finally be making an impact, after spending most of their time in this ecosystem so far being completely bullied. The Quetzes were for now behaving themselves, and to make our lovely Kane the Carnotaurus, who was actually the last remaining of his kind, feel a little bit less lonely, I added some Albertosauruses into the ecosystem, who the Carnotaurus apparently likes to share its territory with. As morning broke, I was about to witness the rematch of the century, as the Ceratosaurus faced off against the Metrocamphosaurus, only for it to take down the Cerato in a single bite. Death appeared to be on agenda this morning, as Absolute Menace continued his killing spree, and I then witnessed a Quetzalcoatlus brutally murder a Pteranodon, throwing it down to the ground in absolute disgust. The Metriacanthosaur's gang had clearly heard of what had happened in the last ecosystem and were out for revenge. This Ceratosaurus just about got away with its life, but as it walked away with some serious injuries, it did look like the Ceratosauruses were now outsiders in this ecosystem. As we approached day 50, it was time to finally begin work on the Lagoon. This ecosystem would house land, flying and aquatic dinos, and it was time to start introducing the last of those with the Lagoon. This was going to be no normal sized lagoon though, but before I could finish making it, the Herrerasaurs ganged up on one of the Albertosaurs. It was an absolute miracle that the Albertosaur managed to make it out of this fight alive, and the Herrerasaurus continued to launch themselves at it, clambering on top of him. Fleeing for its life, the Albertosaur was very lucky to escape this one. On the other side of the ecosystem, in distressing news, a Brachiosaurus was starving to death. It had wandered too far outside of its biome, and even after placing some of its favoured tall nut trees down for it, it was just too weak to eat, and ended up starving to death. It was a sad end for one of our Brachiosaurs. But the work must continue on the lagoon, and I began to place some rocks down and some platforms before having a good look at what creature I was going to release first. Before releasing it though, I had just about enough time to witness Kane kill yet another Dimetrodon. It was now time to welcome our first prehistoric aquatic species to the ecosystem, the Archelon. This prehistoric turtle would certainly enjoy the rocky platforms that I had placed down, and it would be able to stay out of harm's way from any future predators there. After a bit of waiting, the Velociraptors and Atrociraptors had finally found each other and were facing off. The fight didn't get to finish up as an Albertosaurus came wandering in for some food and split it up, but Blue, the alpha of the Velociraptors, had suffered a serious wound from this fight. It was certainly 1-0 to the lesser known species of raptors. The injured Ceratosaur found itself chased down by the Metriacanthosaurs once more and took another brutal hit. It survived the encounter, but later that night passed away in its sleep. It's fair to say at this point that I was wondering if genetically modifying the Metriacanthosaurs was such a good idea after all. With the alpha of their pack being seriously wounded, all hell was breaking loose between the two species of raptors. At first it looked like the Atrociraptors were winning this encounter quite convincingly, but the Velociraptors began to fight back. Both sides suffered deaths, and at the end of a day of fierce fighting, I had both sides down as about even. One biome that was certainly not even was our southern rocky biome, where Diablo the Spinosaur roamed supreme, as I found it with yet another dead Suchomimus. On day 50, to mark the halfway point of this ecosystem's life, I decided it was time for some carnage. This is Darwin, the ecosystem's Indominus Rex. Last time out, Darwin had reigned supreme, killing everything it saw on sight. It would take something special to stop that from happening again. But on a lighter note, in our aquatic ecosystem, it was time to welcome the much more friendly Ichthyosaurus to the ecosystem. I then caught up with Darwin, who was enjoying a snack at his nearby feeder, with his Velociraptor friend, the only species by the way that the Indominus Rex is prepared to share its habitat with. The sheer presence of Darwin appeared to have galvanised the Velociraptors, and just like that, they began to win the war against the Atrociraptors. It even ended up with the death of Reaper, the Atrociraptor who had been the alpha of his pack up until this point. Back with the aquatic ecosystem, the next creature to be introduced was the Plesiosaurus. This early plesiosaur was from the late Jurassic period and fed mainly on fish and squid. Hopefully our Archelon's turtles were not on the menu for them, but as long as they stayed on the rocks, they would be safe either way. Right next to my marine ecosystem, I actually began to create a brand new biome. This would be called the Great Valley, a home for herbivores, and I didn't want them getting out, so I made sure to increase the terrain, making a natural valley of sorts that hopefully the creatures wouldn't wander too far away from. Checking in on Darwin, he had been sleeping throughout the day, as these predators are actually nocturnal, so as nighttime hit, he rose and prepared to hunt. And Albertosaur was just enjoying his dinner at a feeder when a pack of Velociraptors pounced him. The Albertosaur just about managed to throw them all off, and was making his escape when his escape route was cut off by Darwin. I think we all knew the outcome the moment this happened, and the already injured Albertosaur went down in one hit. This deadly duo of Raptors and Indominus was becoming pretty frightening, as I watched Darwin take out a second Albertosaur with the Raptors watching on. The Atrociraptors, however, were not giving up without a fight, and a Velociraptor bit the dust that night, which I was secretly quite glad about, as I was worried that the team of Darwin and the Raptors was an absolute ecosystem killer. Speaking of ecosystem killers, I then find Diablo with the body of Alpha Susan the Suchomimus. Diablo had surely now claimed the rocky riverlands for himself, and that night may have been the most chaotic night in our ecosystem, as I had no time to pay respect to Alpha Susan, as I then found Darwin with the dead body of Kane, the last remaining Carnotaur. It had not been an easy ride for the Carnotaurs in our ecosystem, and this species was now, once more, extinct. So with one apex predator down, it was time to start work on the next one. Before I could do this though, I made the decision to expand the tundra biome. This next predator was likely to drive creatures away from their habitats, so I wanted to make sure that they had somewhere to go. Introducing the Eutyranus, which means feathered tyrant, obviously reflecting the feathered look. This creature was perfectly suited to the harsher conditions of the tundra biome, and would be a real threat to any creature out there. Fittingly, soon after release it began to snow, and the Eutyranus looked right at home. In the marine ecosystem, it was time once more to release another creature, so we welcomed the Dilophosaurus, which was a pretty scary looking creature. So far the marine ecosystem was on its best behaviour though, with no fights breaking out, but as we continue to add more creatures in, this was likely to change. Eutyranus was settling in well, and Darwin was on the prowl looking for his next meal. Unfortunately for him though, it would not be one of our Archaeopteryx, as they were released all the way in the southern section of the ecosystem named the Great Valley. I quickly checked on our Dilophosaurus, who was just chilling on the rock, but Jesus Christ, this thing is scary. Although he arguably wasn't as scary as the next creature to be released, which was the Dilophosaurus. This was an apex predator of its time, and while not quite as big as early estimates suggested, it could still grow up to 10 meters. Not a creature to be messed with at all. And talking of creatures to be messed with, our next set of creatures was certainly that. I planned to release a pair of Giganotosauruses right into the territory that Darwin had been released into. While this might sound like a terrible idea, Darwin had already begun to wander far outside of his territory zone while hunting, and was showing absolutely no signs of coming back. I added a few extra things into our biome to make our new arrivals feel at home, and then prepared to welcome Ryan and Rodri, the Giganotosauruses, into the ecosystem. It appeared that the introduction of a lot of creatures had left the marine reptiles all suffering from chronic stress, which was unfortunate. Apparently the Archelons for some reason were fine with this though, and they were chilling, perfectly happy. Without a mental health nurse on site, there wasn't much I could do for these animals, so instead I released the Dreadnoughtus down into the depths of the Great Valley, away from any carnivores. Not that this gigantic sauropod would be an easy meal of course, not even for Darwin. I then witnessed the last of the Atrociraptors, suffering from internal bleeding, lie down and accept its fate. There was no doubt that the Velociraptors had won the war. I began to expand some biomes so that creatures could be spread out, but then I was taken away by the news that the Eutyranus and Dinosaurus were fighting. In a ferocious battle between the king and queen of the tundra ecosystem, it was the Eutyranus that struck the first blow. While not fatal, the Dinosaurus ran from the fight with severe surface wounds, and would have to stay out of the way from predators if it wanted to survive for the next 24 hours. In our marine ecosystem, it was time to introduce the Tylosaurus, the biggest creature that we'd introduced so far, and one of the largest members of the Mosasaur family. For now, this pack of Tylosaurs could assume the alpha role in the marine section of our ecosystem. In the tundra, the Pyroraptors could smell blood, as they sniffed around the injured Dinosaurus. It was now recovering from its wounds though, so they did think better of an attack. This Eutyranus though had been separated from its pack, and picked a fight with one of the remaining Albertosaurs. One hit from the Eutyranus was all it took for the Albertosaur to retreat, and the species lived on for another day. With Terence the Tyrannosaur sadly passing away earlier in the ecosystem's life, I thought that Matilda might be a bit lonely, so I'd like you all to meet Tommy and Mel the Tyrannosaurs. Hopefully in good time they would find a way to look after Matilda, and I was kind of invested in this T-Rex reunion of sorts, until a quick look at my map showed a bigger problem. Darwin was on his way home. For some reason, after reaching the outskirts of the tundra, Darwin turned around and headed all the way back to the hatchery that he was released from. Perhaps he had forgotten his fur jacket, but the problem was that this territory was now inhabited by our Giganotosaurus pair. As Darwin neared the biome, Rodri woke from his nap and prepared to stand his ground. Darwin came sprinting over the hill and as always didn't think twice about engaging, but perhaps on this occasion he should have. The Giganotosaurus was no easy kill, not even for Darwin, and there would be two on hand to deal with. This was a dangerous game that he was playing. Darwin did just about win the first fight, with Rodri retreating with a broken claw. They did face off again and roared at each other, but this time no fight took place. I was so invested in this drama that I actually missed the death of Timothy the Triceratops, who I found dead with a very guilty looking Tommy next to it. But back to the main event, and Ryan had finally got himself together and was ready to defend his brother. Darwin already came into this fight injured from his last one against a fully fresh Ryan. Both titans landed some brutal hits on each other, but you could tell that the last fight was still impacting Darwin heavily, and he was soon retreating from the fight, damaged, bleeding, and with a concussion injury. At one point I thought that Ryan wasn't going to let him go, as he almost chased after him. Darwin made the sensible decision to try and sleep off some of his injuries, but he would have to stay out of harm's way. Tommy the T-Rex was still causing absolute chaos with the Triceratops family, and after already taking out Timothy earlier, the alpha of the family, he caused organ trauma in another Triceratops, an injury that it would not be able to recover from. Back with Darwin though, as nighttime arrived, he woke up from his slumber and prepared to hunt to aid his recovery. However, he was ambushed by Ryan at the top of the hill, and this time there would be no escape. The main villain of our last ecosystem was dead, and a new king would emerge in our final 30 days. And talking of new kings, the marine ecosystem certainly had one of those. This is Bruce the Megalodon, one of the most famous predators that the Earth has ever seen. With jaws big enough to swallow a car and a bite force up there to rival the T-Rex, the Megalodon was the true king of the aquatic ecosystem. Whether Bruce would behave or not, time would tell, but I made sure to add plenty of great white sharks around the place for him to feed on. From one potential villain to an almost certain villain. On day 70, we would welcome Norman the Indoraptor to the ecosystem. This hybrid dinosaur was going to take some stopping. While not as big as the Indominus, it would be arguably just as dangerous. Its biography stated that it lacked any type of socialization, and its hostile behavior meant that any dinosaur should steer clear. Norman would be highly unlikely to tolerate any creature remotely sharing his space. Which is why it's a shame that this Metriacanthosaur decided to arrive on the scene almost immediately after releasing Norman. About to pounce, Norman decided better of it when a second Metriacanthosaur arrived to save their sibling's life. They got away with that on this time, but if they separated again, they may not be so lucky the next time. And it didn't take too long for this to happen, as Norman was not going to waste this opportunity second time around. Or was he? While Norman certainly won the fight, this genetically stronger Metriacanthosaur withstood the attacks and fled for its life. When you are up against an Indoraptor, there is no shame in running. I named him Warrior, and he immediately appeared to know the value of the strengths in numbers approach, although the injuries he had sustained from the fight would take something to recover from. If Norman was ever to be taken down, I knew that we'd have to make sure we had plenty of apex carnivores on hand, so I began to incubate a pair of Carnotaurus eggs. Over in the rocky biome, I caught Absolute Menace the Therizinosaur and Diablo the Spinosaur, sharing a touching moment together at the feeder. I was soon brought back to reality, however, when an already injured Metriacanthosaur strayed into Norman's path, and this one would not be so lucky. The bad news also was for Warrior, was that he was now suffering from an ingrown claw, and Norman the Indoraptor was watching him, waiting for the easiest kill of his life. Quick check in on Sally the Diplo, by the way. She was doing absolutely fine, even if she was now forced to share her territory with the nearby allosaurs. In our marine ecosystem, I quickly checked up on our scary looking sea otter things, and then released the Dunkleosteris into the ecosystem. This was sure to upset the dynamic a little bit, as most of these aquatic creatures are neutral to each other, but the Megalodon and Donkeys were not a fan of each other at all. This was going to be an interesting battle to observe. The Carcharodontosauruses were now released into the ecosystem, and as an apex predator, they pretty much had this corner of the ecosystem all to themselves, and the only thing remotely close to them that could give them a good fight would be Kevin the Therizino. At this point, Norman was proving to be a bigger menace than Darwin, as he continued his mission of making the Metriacanthosaurs extinct once more. I then caught Henry and Margaret the allosaurs, both hunting a parasaur stealthily in the trees. Once the parasaur realised, they went in for the kill, and by this time for the parasaur, it was too late to get away. We were closing in on releasing the final creatures of this ecosystem at this point, so we went on a bit of a spree. First up was the Australovenator. I bet you can never guess where this dinosaur used to live. Next up was another apex carnivore who joined the Tundra ecosystem. This is Rupert the Acrocanthosaur, and he was going to give the Eutyrannus pack a real run for their money in this biome. I also released a pair of Apatosaurs, who I would like to clarify after last video are not actually the same dinosaur as the Brontosaurus. I was pleased to see that my master plan of getting Matilda some friends had paid off, as I caught Tommy and her having a nap together that night. I then witnessed one of the few remaining Metriacanthosaurs take out a Styracosaur in one hit, as it had wandered too far from its original ecosystem, most likely due to the presence of a certain Indoraptor. The The last sauropod that would grace this ecosystem is the Elasmosaurus, and I released it that night as a snowstorm struck. In the aquatic ecosystem, death finally struck, as an ichthyosaur was killed by a plesiosaur. Up until this point, the aquatic animals had been pretty good, despite the fact they were all suffering from chronic stress. That might be about to change though, as during the storm I released Monty the Mosasaur. The Mosasaurs were the dominant predators of the ocean 66 million years ago, before the mass extinction event that wiped them out. They had never encountered a Megalodon before, but it would be interesting to see if they could coexist or not together. During the storm, I saw that Norman the Indoraptor had developed a common cold due to a lack of rocks. Not quite sure how that one does work, but okay. While I probably should have just let this monster suffer, I had to treat it as equal to all the others, and thus I gave him his desired rocks, and he was now much happier. Checking in on Kevin, he was doing great, and remained remarkably calm as the nearby Carnotaurus passed him on his morning run. The T-Rex were also thriving, and Matilda was clearly relishing having a pack of her own once more. The plesiosaurs though were starting to misbehave, as another ichthyosaur was found dead, which caused me to only half catch Monty the Mosasaur leaping out of the air to grab a shark here. Rupert the Acrocanthosaur was getting himself settled in, and I named the remaining Velociraptor Smarty, as it had somehow managed to locate a quiet corner of the ecosystem all to itself. Ryan and Rodri were enjoying their own area of the ecosystem all to themselves. After taking out Darwin, any predator would be foolish to clash with them, after what they did to our dominant predator. After the Quetzalcoatlus clearly won our aviary ecosystem battle, I decided to release it into the wild and see if it could survive. This is Roman, and as long as he didn't stray too far away from his hatchery, he should be absolutely fine. There was plenty of fish in the nearby area, and he had everything he needed to survive. In the Tundra, Rupert was still facing off against the Utaranus pack. Despite there being 3 of them in the same proximity, Rupert was not put off whatsoever, and brought this Utaranus to the brink of death. Back with the Rexes, Mel the Tyrannosaur was apparently sick of taking orders from the older Matilda, and was challenging her for her throne. This was not a fight to a death, just for the alpha around these parts, and the challenger Mel was successful. For now at least. Later that night, I was surprised to find a dead Utaranus body. The Uti had apparently died in a fight with our remaining Albertosaur. Roman the Quetz seemed to be enjoying himself in the outside world, and Diablo the Spinosaur still roamed the riverlands. I was a little bit worried about survival of the Utaranus, as he had fled so far from Rupert after his attack that he was getting dangerously close to Dilophosaur territory. And talking of getting dangerously close to territory, this Allosaur had wandered into Indoraptor territory. After realising what it was dealing with, it did make a hasty retreat. The second to last creature to be released into the ecosystem was a Deinonychus, who would be roaming the outskirts of the Tundra biome, while a pack of Utaranus lurked nearby. In the marine biome, a Liopleurodon then killed a Nothosaurus just because it was passing by, and we then welcomed the final creature to our ecosystem, the Scorpios Rex. Now, I've never come across this hybrid dinosaur before, and my first thoughts upon it were, 1, it can't be that dangerous, and oh my god, this thing is ugly. Besides, it was introduced not too far from our pair of Carcharodontosauruses, who were having no trouble terrorising absolutely everything in the nearby area, so I thought, how much trouble could it really be? With only 15 days left of our ecosystem journey now, survivor the Utaranus made his dramatic return to the Tundra biome after a brief absence to heal from his wounds, and he had apparently come back with a mission: to become alpha of his pack, and he did just that, by defeating the current alpha and ascending to the throne. In the aviary, the Quetzes were still being total menaces, while Bruce the Megalodon was showing the temperament of a golden retriever, and being a very good boy. Not quite what I'd expected. I'd sort of forgotten to feed my Deinonychuses, so I placed some meat down for them, and then caught our Australopithecus being best friends with this Amargasaurus, which is not really a match that I'd expected. I then realised that I'd clearly spoken far too soon about Bruce, as I found a dead floating donkey floating on the surface of our marine biome. Monty the Mosasaur, on the other hand, was so far still being a good boy. Unfortunately that night, Henry the Allosaur passed away from the wounds of his fight with Norman the Indoraptor. And in the Tundra, Rupert and the Utaranuses were maintaining peace for now, and as morning struck, the T-Rexes woke up and prepared to hunt. After the Carcharodontosaurs had crashed the ecosystem party, Kevin had been forced to relocate, and was just chilling in his new territory that he had claimed solely for himself. Well, that is him and Roman the Quetz, who you can see in the background here. Monty the Mosasaur was clearly done being a pacifist, and that morning he attacked a Tylosaur, and while he didn't kill it immediately, he ended up going back for round 2 shortly after Saur, and a Tylosaur was taken down. Our Carcharodontosaurus pair had been fascinated by the Elasmosaurus for a while now, and finally brought up the courage to string an attack sequence together. They ended up giving up after realising that they couldn't bring it down in a couple of bites, but perhaps they were playing the long game with this one, hoping that they could strike an infected wound or something similar that would tick away at its health. The alpha predator of the Tundra, Rupert, came face to face with the Dinosaurus later that day, and despite having some nasty surface wounds after the fight, as the Dinosaurus fled, there was only one real winner of this fight. After his morning snack, Monty the Mosasaur had decided that Tylosaur was actually far more tasty than Great White Shark, so he decided to take out another one. The Carnotaurus still tried to whittle down the Elasmosaur, and Bruce the Megalodon was still an only one kill, while Monty was on 2 now. Oh, hang on a minute, scratch that, that's 2 done closed down. As nighttime hit, Rupert finished off the Dinosaurus, and I then watched the reuniting of 2 Albertosaurs, who had been separated for so long that I assumed one of them to be dead. Still, it was a touching moment to see them being reunited. The Carnivores were still not giving up on the Elasmosaurs, although yet to have any luck. But the main event that happened that night was when the Scorpios Rex faced off against Kevin the Therizino. I really thought that Kevin was about to show him who was boss around here, but I quickly realised at the start of this fight that that was not going to happen. Despite being the smaller creature, the deadly tail attack the Scorpios Rex had was not to be messed with, and it just dealt far more damage than any of poor Kevin's attacks. It was a sad end for our poor Therizinosaur, who I felt had not been done justice, and my anger against our hybrid creatures was growing. An Australopithecus took out one of our remaining 2 Velociraptors, which meant that Smarty was now the only one remaining. Smarty, of course, was completely unaware of this, as he was instead far more focused on hunting down Styracosaurus in what was previously a herbivore paradise. That day, we had another snowstorm, and creatures of the ecosystem prepared to deal with the harsh conditions coming their way. Apart from Smarty, of course, who continued to kill anything in sight. When the snowstorm passed, I found the dead body of an ecosystem legend. Absolute Menace the Herrerasaur was dead, taken down by Tommy the T-Rex, with a very respectable kill record. With 2 Albertosaurs on the scene, they clearly now felt confident enough to challenge Rupert for the alpha role of the Tundra biome. This was always going to be a mistake though, and the Albertosaurs were both lucky to survive this encounter, as Rupert once more asserted his dominance. When a wandering Australopithecus wandered into the path of Rodri, he did not hesitate in taking it down with just a single bite. These 2 Giganotosaurs had not taken out Darwin for nothing, and would not have their territory invaded by a foreign species. Norman clearly had the same view as this, as the last Allosaur left entered his territory and was not going to make it back out alive. Of course, survivor the Utyrannus, now separated from his pack, was still going strong, and seemed to have built up a new friendship with the Pyroraptors. Monty the Mosasaur was killing more Tylosaurs, which was his favourite hobby now, and in the desert, Tommy had heard that his sibling Mel had taken the role of Alpha, and he was not happy. He was so unhappy, in fact, that he had to take this title all for himself, and after defeating Mel in a battle, he did just that. Smarty the Velociraptor had now found the Oviraptors, which was always going to be a disaster waiting to happen, and the injured Albertosaur was set to have a cold night in the snow, as it attempted to recover from its fight with Rupert. As the morning dawned, the Metriacanthosaur made its way towards the Indoraptor territory. I thought that it was game over for sure, but somehow with only 3% health left, the Metrio, despite suffering a concussion, managed to get its way out of there. The remaining healthy Albertosaur decided to try and face up to Rupert, but after seeing the size difference and the state of its sibling, decided against it, and later that night the injured Albertosaur passed away from its injuries sustained in its original battle with Rupert. And death seemed to be everywhere in this ecosystem right now, as the injured Metrio, which had nearly got away, was eventually hunted back down by Norman. In an attempt to get revenge for its sibling, the other Albertosaur took on Rupert, but paid a very heavy price for it. Diablo the Spinosaur was still roaming the desert lands, but Tommy the Tyrannosaur had now entered its kingdom. Whether these 2 giants could be kept apart or not would remain to be seen. The last Metriacanthosaur remaining was Daz, who was the original alpha of the pack, but after coming up against Norman, there was just simply no hope for him, and another species was killed off by our hybrids. In the forest, Smarty the Velociraptor was just chilling, but not far away a titanic battle was raging between the now hungry Scorpios Rex and a Carnodontosaur. The hybrid dinosaurs did not belong in this ecosystem. They were too ruthless, and as Owen Grady once said, they were killing for sport. But the Carnodontosaurus barely got out of this fight alive, and I then realised that the Scorpios Rex was not only deadly, but also had the ability to poison its prey, leaving lasting damage even when the fight is over. So I had to come up with a plan to remove it. Enter Kevin 2.0. Kevin 2.0 was a genetically buff Therizino, who had one mission: to take out the Scorpios Rex and get revenge for the first Kevin, and save the entire ecosystem, of course, while he was at it. I named him Kevin's Revenge, and he strutted out of the enclosure with purpose. However, before it could turn its attention to Kevin, the Scorpios Rex set its sights on the other Carcharodontosaurus, and was going to make another species extinct if it could help it. The Carcharodontosaurus was landing some hits, but the trouble was that it wasn't just doing nearly as much damage as the Scorpio was, especially when you consider the poison attacks that the Scorpio Rex also lands. It was an unfair fight, and the Carchara fled. The only good news was that Norman had seemingly begun to starve. He had eaten absolutely everything around him and was now beginning to pay the price. He would have to get moving and find some prey, or he would die. As the evening began, we finally got the matchup that we wanted, as Kevin's Revenge squared off against the Scorpios Rex. Despite being so buff though, this fight was still from a fair match. While the Scorpios got the first hit in, and thus getting its poison attack in, Kevin's Revenge just appeared to be shocked. Even when he did get some hits in, it did a measly 9% damage to the Scorpios Rex, and as a snowstorm started, on the brink of death, Kevin retreated. Just like this Carcharodontosaur though, he would not live to see out the storm. The next morning, as dusk turned to dawn, I checked on Norman and he was still starving. While not one to advocate for starving animals, I decided that in Norman's case I was quite okay with this, because the only way this ecosystem would return to any sort of normality would be if all the hybrid dinosaurs were extinguished. A lost Yutyrannus had wandered far too far outside of its natural habitat, and it ended up in the far regions of the desert biome. Unfamiliar with the prey here, it foolishly took on a Triceratops. It lost the fight and it was now suffering from organ trauma. Fittingly, it would leave Survivor as the last of the Yutyrannuses. That afternoon, I witnessed something truly terrible. Norman the Indoraptor had somehow managed to locate a goat from a nearby feeder, and was now no longer starving to death. I felt quite sorry also for this baryonyx in the rocky terrain. For the survivors that had managed to survive the wrath of Diablo, they had now had to deal with Tommy and Mel, who had decided to venture into the biome. This baryonyx didn't stand a chance. In search of food, the Dilophosaurs and Deinonychus came face to face, which resulted in a resounding win for the genetically buffed Dilophosaurs. As these two packs came face to face over the same scenario, the result would repeat itself over and over again, with the Dilophosaurs coming out on top and winning this battle. But it wouldn't matter who won these fights if I couldn't find a way to deal with our wandering hybrids on the loose. No dino would be safe while these lived. So I had to come up with a plan. Enter Tony and Peter, our Giganotosaur superheroes. This species has already taken down one hybrid, and I would now need them to do the same again here. As they entered the biome, the Scorpios Rex, who I decided to call Otto, immediately expressed his disapproval, and a fight broke out between himself and Tony. Both sides took blows, with the obvious poison damage always going to be a factor, but in the end it was Otto who scurried off in defeat. Of course, with a whole 5 minutes of poison damage to come Tony's way, this was probably a smart call, but if the Scorpios Rex was going to survive here, it would need to play this fight pretty cleverly. As the snowstorm began, I watched both sets of creatures carefully. Peter and Otto came face to face and roared at each other, but Peter backed off. At first, I thought this was going to be a critical mistake, as giving Otto too much time to recover would end in the death of us all. But then Peter charged in. It had all been a bluff, and a clever one at that, as Otto was hit by the element of surprise, and Peter got the first hit in, which was huge. Peter went on to get the second hit, and at that point, Otto was on his last legs. A Giganotosaurus saviour went in for the kill, and did not disappoint. 2 down and 1 to go, before life could return to somewhat normality. We still, however, had one creature to deal with, Norman the Indoraptor. Still starving, Norman received a spot of luck when the last remaining Dinosaurus ran right into his lap. It fled at the sight of him, but after a quick rest, Norman began to hunt it down. After spotting it in the distance, he charged, and this time there would be no getting away for our Dinosaurus. Norman was about half health from starving, so when the Dinosaurus did get a hit in this fight, I thought it might actually be a competitive fight. However, the next hit, the Dinosaurus went down, and Norman could finally eat at last. We would just have to pray that he didn't find his way into another biome, or nothing would be safe. That night, just as he began to get hungry again, Norman caught another goat to keep off those hunger pains, but by the morning I did find him starving again. While I waited to see what happened, I witnessed Clash of the Cretaceous Titans, as Matilda the Tyrannosaur faced her arch nemesis the Triceratops, in what turned out to be a very one-sided fight. In the forest, a brave Yutyrannus decided to try and challenge Ryan, the Indominus killer, to a fight. A brave move, and while it didn't emerge victorious, it did manage to emerge with its life, and giving Ryan a minor fracture, which was pretty impressive. However, later that night, Ryan would get revenge, and the Yutyrannus would be no more. The storm had now left Norman in a critical state. The extreme cold had no doubt made him even more hungry, and as I watched him take a drink, I knew that the end was near. In the end, on the morning of day 100, it was Norman's lust to kill that had been his downfall. Killing for sport rather than hunger had left him with nothing left to live on. With the hybrids taken out, balance could once more be restored to our ecosystem, and some of our favourite creatures could be returned to their environments, safe in the knowledge that if they remained in their biomes, they would be safe. Ryan and Rodri, the Giganotosaurs, continue to rule the middle of the map. Bruce and Monty appeared to have become the most unlikely of friends, and Diablo ran the Riverlands. As so often it does, life had simply found a way. Thank you all for watching my latest ecosystem video. I will ask if you enjoyed the video, please do remember to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and comment what your favourite moment was down in the comments below. Next up for my Ark fans, we have a return to the Ark franchise with Extinction with just Raptors, so I'll see you guys in about 3 weeks for that. In the meantime guys, have a wonderful rest of your day, look after yourselves, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye bye for now.